Hi, I'm Brian Anderson, and you're here on Head On. Tonight my guest is John Horn, who's a social planner with the City of Nanaimo. And John, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what a social planner does. I take it it's not organizing the after-hours entertainment.
No, they don't ask me to put on parties. I'm terrible at that.
Okay.
But thanks for having me on your show. The social planner, what I do is I help nonprofit societies and the local government address social issues. Think of things like homelessness or food security issues, say people who are hungry. Affordable housing is a part of my job, looking at the issues of mental health and illness, addictions, how they affect our community. So if you think of the social problems, really my mandate is to sort of coalesce the community around developing solutions to those problems and implementing them.
Well, you mentioned affordable housing, and we've got a short clip here with the Mayor of Vancouver talking about housing and affordability and their, I guess, lack of stock. But we've got a little clip we'll run here.
As a city for decades, we didn't create much rental housing. That's why we're in a big hole right now, and because people are coming from all over the world. So we've been creating about 2,000 new units a year at council, and that's a mix of purpose-built rental housing, laneway houses, secondary suites. We need to keep that pace going because we're not really catching up with the many years of decline. So there's a lot of rental housing coming in these next few years. At least 2,000 units a year will be built.
So we're back, and John, Gregor Robertson was talking about affordable housing, and I understand the city has some recent news to do with affordable housing.
Yeah, we're very pleased. The British Columbia government, through the BC Housing Corporation, has announced some funding for projects in Nanaimo. So we have 4 projects that are they're preliminary acceptance. So there's still work to be done and final approvals on these projects. But preliminary acceptance for 4 projects in Nanaimo, totaling about $18.5 million worth of capital. And that'll be around the 150 unit count over 4 different projects. So it's a fantastic investment in our community in affordable housing. We're really pleased that BC Housing has made this monies available to the local societies to put this product up.
So would those all be built in my neighborhood, which is Harewood?
No, the societies, unlike the previous round where the city owned the land and made it available, this is land owned by nonprofit societies. So in essence, they're going to land generally not quite in the downtown core, but it's not a far-flung piece of geography we're looking at, essentially within 5 miles of the city center. So, yeah.
Okay. Now,
there is one project up in the north end.
One in the north end, okay. So you mentioned affordable housing, and when we were chatting earlier, you mentioned that there's a difference between affordable housing and just straight like market housing or
yeah. So in my activities, when I do things around affordable housing, it's housing that's aimed at a price point well below the market rates. So it may be subsidized by a level of government or operated by a nonprofit society that's not generating returns to investors or returns to the owner. So they're able to offer the product at a lower price. So there's no profit incentive, and there's a motivation to bring the price of the rent down and down and down. That's what I call affordable housing, and it's usually subsidized by the government at some level. Affordability of housing, that's a different picture. That means when the housing stock in your community that's available on the market is so out of reach for the average resident of this community that only people from outside can afford to purchase in that community. So it's the ability of regular people like yourself and myself to go and either own a home or just go rent a market-based apartment or a condo or whatever we like, and that's the difference. And it's not subsidized, but the rest of us still have to deal with the cost of housing, so.
And I think what Robertson was talking about in Vancouver, they have a vacancy rate that's running from 0.5% in some areas, in the more urban areas or high density areas, up to about 1.5, and then it gets a little lesser as you move out into the Fraser Valley. So I think, and his comment was that they've sort of passed on, or I guess been uninvolved in making sure there was enough housing being built. So is that the same situation in Nanaimo?
It's pretty consistent right across the country, actually. There isn't a lot of rental housing that's been purpose-built by the development community over the last 2 decades. As a result, the supply of rental housing has not much increased. That puts a ton of pressure on existing stock, and it forces the price of that stock up. So if we relied solely on the private sector to build rental housing in our community, they haven't really been doing that. And that's created an issue where there's very few apartments and a lot of people chasing those apartments. That puts a lot of price pressure on things, and it gives a lot of landlords the ability to really select who they want to live in their unit. That kind of puts a barrier in the way of people who are really low income, and especially those who aren't able to present as well to the landlord for whatever reason. Maybe they've had a rough life, maybe they don't dress well, maybe they don't speak as well. Those folks tend to be the last people on the list to get that vacant apartment. So even though the vacancy rate tells you how many apartments are being chased by how many people, there's this other piece about, well, out of the crowd of applicants, who generally gets into those units? And it's not the people who are, who are struggling. So that's another kick-on effect that happens. But essentially, it's the lack of purpose-built rental housing that's bedeviling us all.
You bring up a good point. It's not like rental cars where it might be first come, first serve. Housing, you've got a certain criteria that you have to meet.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of discretion the landlord can exercise as to who they want to rent their unit to, and that's fair. But it does, when there's lots of rental around, people, they tend to be not quite as picky. But if there's a big lineup at your door, you may not select that individual who's disadvantaged or marginalized, so they feel the brunt particularly.
Now, when you mention, and you phrased it nicely, don't present well, a few years ago, the city had some concerns because I think they had 3 projects that they'd committed to the province to build or to bring forward, and it was all low barrier housing, and there's certain sectors of the community that were up in arms, to be honest, about low barrier housing. How are the units that you're talking about different than, say, what was happening 3 years ago?
When we did the projects 3 years ago, well, it's going on almost 10 years ago, we started those. The goal was to address homelessness specifically. So we really were focusing on individuals who had been homeless for a long time and were homeless often for a long time. So that requires a bit more of a support structure than, let's say, your average can't afford to rent person. So you had to have staff. The buildings had to be designed for security purposes, and with in mind that these individuals are going to need a lot of support to stay housed. So those projects were aimed at chronically homeless people, and we set certain conditions in those buildings because we wanted those folks to be housed. The kind of stock we're talking about in this round is really affordable housing. There's no staffing dollars attached to these. There's not even an ongoing subsidy, generally speaking, attached to these. So they will be affordable housing for people who are self-maintaining, don't need a staff on site, don't need a lot of help. They just actually need a break in the rent. And that's chiefly what this stock is aimed at. There are some exceptions. There are societies who cater to those with mental illnesses or those with a developmental disability. They're amongst the recipients of this housing money. So there is a special needs focus in some of these projects, but generally speaking, they're for people who can manage themselves in their own units.
Because I think I saw an announcement or a press release that Jim Spinelli issued, and it had to do with a project that's very close to Buttertubs. I guess it's just off of Bowen Road. So they're going to be one of the recipients?
They will. They have conjecturally been awarded about 50 or 55 units, and there's lots of design work that goes into these projects because they're new builds. So you have to kind of start with a number, and then you design, and you may end up with a bit of a different number. But they're aiming at seniors, and the second project funded in Nanaimo aiming at seniors is the Mount Benson Seniors Housing Society, and they've been conjecturally awarded another 55 units. So there's obviously a sense amongst the folks at BC Housing that housing for low-income seniors is something that we haven't done for a while, and maybe this is a time to do that now. So fully half of that allotment is going to be aimed at seniors, and they're going to be low-income seniors.
Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that these units are built to a lesser standard. I think they're built, the building code's a building code, so they're built, everything's perfectly safe. It's not like you're building something that's cheaper. I mean, it might be smaller.
One thing that's interesting is when you ask people like BC Housing who are in the business of rental housing, they'll tell you that the initial capital cost of a building is about 20% of the lifetime cost. So if you think about that, that means that every nickel you save on energy, for example, by insulating the walls, pays off big time, because 80% of your costs over the lifetime of a building are going to be the running of that building. So it just makes economic sense if you're a developer and you're hanging on to buildings for 60 years, as they do at BC Housing, you would begin to calculate, wow, if I make that wall a little more insulated over 60-year operations, that's going to, yeah, that well pays for itself. So the inclination on public housing, because we hold that stock for long periods of time, is to invest heavily in things like energy efficiencies, that sort of stuff, so that the overall lifetime cost of that project comes down, and the operating cost for the nonprofit society is diminished. And as a bonus, the clients don't have to pay hefty hydro bills. So that really saves everyone all along the way. And so they do put a lot more emphasis on energy efficiency and sturdy buildings than most construction.
So does the city have plans? Like, I know that the city of Vancouver, obviously that's a much bigger market, but they have certain incentives for, free market housing, or what I call market housing, I guess, for landlords to develop property, and the city either reduces the development cost charges or some other things to make sure that these houses are kept in a rental pool. Is Nanaimo in that situation?
We have a variety of things that we'll do to support the people to develop housing. So we have a spectrum that runs from, at one end might be the emergency shelter system, where you're really dealing with humans who have no ability to pay and are in extreme distress. At the other end of the spectrum would be, let's say, home ownership, just unfettered home ownership with no government subsidies. And in between that two poles, we kind of differentiate our response depending on how much you're helping. So we might give an emergency shelter for the homeless more financial support than we would give to someone who's aiming at affordable home ownership. And that's because those folks have much less ability to pay than the folks up at the affordable home ownership. So we kind of tailor our response to the level of distress, if you will, that the applicant is approaching. When it comes to fully market, no subsidies, aimed squarely at the ability to pay crowd, we don't actually offer a lot. What we are doing now is embarking on a housing strategy. And that's going to look at affordability, not affordable, which is for low-income folks, but the affordability of housing going forward for the rest of us who have to buy it on the market. That may well include some recommendations around how we support market developments. Right now, our efforts are pretty squarely aimed at the nonprofit societies who own and operate housing on a nonprofit basis. And that's mainly where our subsidies go. But we're going to be looking, like Vancouver, at options to increase the affordability of housing, so to speak, for the mass of people, the bulk of people who have to buy on the market.
And that certainly makes sense, because making things easier or cheaper for a not-for-profit organization is a heck of a lot different than, say, a for-profit landlord that's developing something that's similar.
The nonprofits tend to plow any gains into lower rents. And of course, that's the opposite effect when you're an investor in a project. Any gains you manage to squeeze out along the way generally return to the investor. So nonprofits have a way of saying, if you shave $100,000 off my mortgage, then my rent goes down $7 per unit per month. Thank you very much. And that's what I'll do with that savings. So that's where we really get great leverage, because every time we chip in on a mortgage or reduce the cost of a construction project, it shows up as lower rent for the end user. And that's really where we want the money to land.
Now, I know that we've started to move back, or I guess change things slightly with the city, in that we're talking about densification. And I guess in Vancouver, I know there's density bonusing that's used as an incentive. And I think Vancouver Enterprises was an organization that worked with the city to develop rental housing units by working with the developer and the city to make more housing stock available. Is that something that Nanaimo does?
Yes, and we have a list of amenities that the developer can do to get extra density on their projects without having to go through a rezoning process or anything like that. The density bonusing is a fairly common tool in municipalities to encourage. In a city like Vancouver, that additional density has a really high value to it because it's Vancouver, right? And everything's worth $1 gazillion.
Yep.
So you give a fella 2 extra floors on his condo tower, that's substantial, and it really motivates them. In Nanaimo, we try to use those same motivators. So if you, for example, have a really green building, we'll give you additional density in recognition of the fact that you've really tried to be environmentally friendly in your building. Similarly, if you provide social housing in your complex, if you're a developer, we recognize that and we'll provide you additional density with that. So developers can choose from a menu of things that they can do, public art, there's a variety of ways that they can say, I'll contribute to my community, and geez, as a thank you, I get this extra density. Fantastic, that really motivates me to do that thing. So social housing is part of that.
So when you're talking about social housing now, we have one in Nanaimo that's co-op housing.
Yes.
Is that fall under the same sort of
It
auspice?
doesn't, not necessarily, because it's not government subsidized, which is typically, so the definition for true social housing has a level of government somewhere throwing some money at it somehow. In a co-op environment, it's slightly different in that the profit motive isn't necessarily what drives them to create that community. They want to create a livable, so their aspirations are different than a standard development model, which is about putting a product into the market that people want and they'll pay for it. In a co-op model, you're saying, let's create a community. And in that community, we'll design a building that fits for everybody. But the goal is to create a vibrant community and not lose our shirts in the process, right? So it's a slightly different model, and it doesn't require government subsidy, and often they don't have any subsidy. But the goals of the development are quite different. So the buildings tend to look different and act different because they have different aspirations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense because I think if you're doing things, I guess, cooperatively, it's slightly different, but it's more the structure, as you say. Yeah.
Some of them have an agreement where you purchase the unit at the cost of that unit, which is the cost of construction, and then you're not able to resell that unit for a large profit. You're able to resell that unit to somebody else for the same price you paid for it. And what happens over time is that becomes a really affordable way. And the goal of the co-op, of course, is not to make profit. They want people to be able to live in a community and be affordable. So they actually get to an affordable housing place sometimes. Other co-ops have decided that they should let their members sell into the market at the market price for that unit and we capture any gains and retain their equity and all those sort of nice things. So they're modeled kind of differently across the landscape, and some of them just try to make it a great place to live.
Now we're talking density and densification. As far as the city's concerned, I think part of that, or part of it that's driving that is, transportation, bus routes. You want people, basically, if we're all single-family houses along bus routes, it's really difficult to get people riding buses. If you've got greater density along connectors, then it makes more sense.
Yeah, the transit issue is one that's often talked about in the larger context, like Vancouver, because that's a big part of the driver of their economy. If you don't have transit, then you aren't able to function. So for Nanaimo, the costs are a little bit different. It isn't that business grinds to a halt because we don't have transit, as it might in a place like Vancouver. But it just means that becomes that much more expensive for all of us to do everything, and including your municipality, to send sewer pipes to that house, to send a bus down that empty road to your one home at the end, and maybe you'll get on it, maybe you won't. That means we're not able to offer a transit service that's as frequent as a city like Victoria would, where there's a lot of units in a small space. So it does begin a chicken and egg question. If you want better transit, you need more housing. If you want more housing, you need better transit. It's difficult for small communities like ourselves to work our way out of that loop, if you will.
Which comes first?
It usually comes more housing first, and then the transit follows. So but in Vancouver, when they build like metro lines, the people follow the transit. It's because metros are a little bit different than bus systems. People will accrue around a metro stop faster than they will around a bus stop, because that's a permanent fixture. Bus stops can change, right? So they don't have the same impact.
And I actually ran across something recently. It's probably a total change of subject, but where they're putting in these Skytrain stations, the organization is now actually leasing the airspace above the
Yeah.
Skytrain station for housing.
Yes, and that makes total sense to me. Why wouldn't you go out of your apartment and go downstairs and get on the metro or Skytrain or whatever it's
Yeah.
called? So I think that makes a lot of sense. One thing they have commented on is that when they put up a new Skytrain station and a new line, then there's this tremendous interest from the business community, the development community, that, oh, there's a new Joyce metro station. Let's build a bunch of housing and commercial around there, because that's really going to be a winner. People are going to buy that, and they're going to go to those stores. What happens then is that traditionally there's been these stretches of Vancouver where there hasn't been a lot of transit options, and so there's a lot of low-income units in those stretches. They're not necessarily desirable or amenable. Now what happens, you put a Joyce Skytrain station at the end of that line, that whole street suddenly becomes much more attractive to developers. Hey, there's a mass transit stop at the end of that block. I'm going to buy the block in front of that and develop that. So it has the effect, and they're just discovering that this is a bit of a problem, of driving out low-income housing and to be replaced by market-based housing that caters to the transit stop. That's a fantastic outcome if you're a transit person. Now more people are taking the bus or the Skytrain. Perfect, right? If you're an advocate for an affordable housing, you've just watched a whole neighborhood go from relatively low budge, because it's hard to get anywhere from that place, to, everyone wants to live there, and guess who gets squeezed out at the bottom end of that spectrum is those who can't afford to keep up with the price increases that go with having a transit stop suddenly appear in your neighborhood. So it's a two-fold sword, and they haven't quite got their heads around how they're going to do that, but one response has been to look at how do we ensure that we maintain that affordable housing stock, even when we begin to enhance the amenities and features in the neighborhood. You don't want that just to be the precursor to driving all the poor people out. So you've got to think about those things ahead of time before the development community grabs that site and does what they do best, which is to make add value to it and resell it into the market. So.
Well, and you mentioned the market, because the housing stock generally, if the market keeps going up, I mean, how do our kids, how can they afford to buy a house next door or whatever else? How do we deal with that?
Victoria's made a specialty out of pinching those in Vancouver who can't afford to live there anymore. So they've lured a number of high-tech, and I use the word lured in the most generous sense, that they have brought into Victoria a substantial amount of high-tech industry. And the rationale for them moving to Victoria was, we can't afford to live in Vancouver, my staff. I may be able to, as the owner of the company, afford the commercial rent, but my staff have to commute from way out in the valley every day, and they quit on me because it's too far. So when I go to Victoria, hey, they can afford to live here, even though it seems like a lot to a guy from Nanaimo. That's one of the outcomes of having unaffordable housing, is that your neighbors begin to poach your talent from you by offering a better package to the people. Maybe we could have done that if we'd put our mind to it. It doesn't seem quite cricket to prey on the Vancouver like that, but it's all a competitive game. So in that sense, I think that we have to kind of think a little bit about what's our strategy, what key advantage do we have, because our housing stock is cheaper. And we got to keep it that way, because we will never compete with the Vancouvers and Victorias in terms of, hey, what a cool place to live. We're not going to win that game. But we might win the game that says, you come here, it's a nice community, we support each other, and you know what, you can actually live here without 7/10 of your income going to the rent. And that's a really attractive proposition for people. And I think we got to maintain that competitive advantage, if you will. So.
Well, and brings up a whole other topic for another night, would be fast ferry, which the city's also looking at. So when something comes out on that, and I know that's supposed to be coming due the end of December or sometime in December, so should get some results from that. But
as a city planner, I have an internal struggle, and one is that when we attract families and business and development, we create prosperity for a whole bunch of people. And that's a great thing from my perspective. Yeah. But at the same time, there's a small group of people who pay the price. Typically, it's renters and those on the margins. And so while I want, on one hand, to enhance the prosperity for us all, and God bless the homeowners of Nanaimo who see their equity raising year after year, that's a good thing for them. But there is a price to be paid, and we have to find that balancing act where we're not sacrificing the needs of those for the needs of those, or vice versa. And that's a bit of a balance, and that's sort of what your social planner tries to do, is balance those things. So.
Well, you bring up a good point, and I think life is about balance. It's about choices. But we're virtually out of time. So thank you, John, for the discussion and the information. And I wish you well.